Tonight we step into a world of impossible green. You're not in a forest, not in a meadow. You're on a gravel path so white it glows in the twilight, and stretching before you is a vast, low tapestry of woolly grey-green. It's not a plant, it's a pattern. Intricate, swirling, interlocking loops and knots, like a piece of lace the size of a ballroom floor, but rendered in living boxwood. The air is cool and carries the damp, peppery scent of crushed herbs and damp earth. In the distance, a fountain whispers, its rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. This is not nature as you know it. This is nature as mathematics. A verdant equation, solved. A wilderness, argued into silence by geometry and will. You are in the garden of a Renaissance cardinal, and this is his vision of paradise, a place where every leaf knows its place. One wrong snip here, one rebellious tendril, and the entire illusion collapses. Frankly, in his world, you probably wouldn't survive the afternoon. Your modern sensibilities, your appreciation for a good, wild, untamed bramble, would mark you as a heretic of horticulture, a barbarian at the gilded gate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Because this story isn't just about gardening. It's about a moment in history when humanity looked at the chaotic, messy, dangerous world and said, "No. We can do better. We can draw better." It's about the audacious belief that with enough knowledge, enough money, and enough sheer stubbornness, you could force the very essence of life, growing, sprawling, unpredictable life, to sit down, be quiet, and form a perfect square. Or a circle. Or a complex, eight-pointed star. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with that cardinal. It's the early 1500s. He's not just a man of God, he's a man of power, of politics, of exquisite taste. He's read the newly rediscovered texts of ancient Rome. He's funded artists who paint perfect perspective. He understands the world through ratios, through harmony, through the sacred geometries that Plato insisted underpin the cosmos. His church is a monument to proportion. His palace is a study in symmetry. So why, he reasons, should the world outside his window be a slovenly, unkempt mess? It shouldn't. The garden must become the next canvas. The lawn, a sheet of pristine vellum. The hedges, the drawn lines of a grand, living theorem. You stand where he would stand, on a raised terrace looking down. This is the first and most important mainstream historical fact of our tale. The Renaissance garden is always designed to be seen from above. It is a picture, a veduta. The terrace is your viewing platform, the garden your living painting, and the landscape beyond, carefully framed by avenues of trees, your glorious backdrop. Control of the view is control of the world. From here, you can see the logic of it all. The geometric beds, called parterres de broderie for their embroidery-like patterns, are closest, their designs crisp and legible. Beyond them, straight allays arrow into the distance, lined with mathematically spaced trees whose tops have been shaved into perfect green pom-poms. Further still, a hill might be sculpted into a theater, or a woodland wilderness tamed into orderly groves. Everything is sightlines and axes. It's a visual demonstration of authority that says, "My reason extends as far as I can see." To unsettle that perfect view, amongst that sweet basil and lavender, the gardeners would often plant strands of Herba mercurialis, mercury herb. Not for its looks. It was a powerful, and frankly dangerous, laxative. The idea? Its strong, unpleasant scent, released when brushed against, was believed to repel moles and other burrowing creatures that might dare to disrupt the sacred geometry of the root systems beneath your feet. So even below the surface, in the dark, unseen world, a form of chemical warfare was waged to maintain order. The garden was a totalitarian state. And this brings us to our first open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these gardens were ultimately an expression of profound harmony with nature, or an act of profound violence against it. Was it a collaboration, a guiding hand helping nature achieve its own latent perfection? Or was it a conquest, a domineering imposition of human intellectual vanity onto the unruly flesh of the living world? As you look down at that green lace, so serene, so silent, ask yourself, are you looking at a prayer or a proclamation of war? The shears are about to answer. The garden you stand in is a silent, green argument. An argument against everything that came before. To understand the sheer, radical confidence of these clipped hedges and ruler-straight paths, you need to feel what it was arguing against. So let's rewind your senses. Let's step out of the cardinal's sun-drenched geometry and plunge back, just a century or two, into the garden of a medieval castle. The smell changes first, from clean herbal pepper to the damp, fecund rot of a midden heap too close to the kitchen door. The order evaporates. You're in a practical, cluttered, muddy plot, a confusing quilt of purposes. Here, a patch of onions fights for light next to sprawling cabbages. There, medicinal herbs, hyssop, rue, sage, tangle with strawberry runners. A simple arbor of vines offers scant shade. A bee skep hums in a corner. This isn't a place for contemplation. It's a larder, a pharmacy, a tool shed. It's utilitarian chaos. Nature here is a provider, but also a threat, a source of nourishment, but also of weeds, blight, and the lurking, unseen humors that could cause disease. The wilderness beyond the wall is a dark, impenetrable forest, full of wolves, outlaws, and spiritual danger. The garden is a frail, muddy bastion against that overwhelming wild. Now, blink forward again to your Renaissance terrace. Feel the shift? It's tectonic. The medieval mind saw the world as a fallen place, a corrupted text to be endured while awaiting heavenly salvation. The Renaissance mind, drunk on rediscovered classical texts, began to see it as a puzzle to be solved, a book to be deciphered, a cosmos, a beautiful, ordered system. And if the universe was governed by mathematical laws, as the ancients said, then why shouldn't your backyard be? This was the profound philosophical pivot, from enduring chaos to constructing cosmos. The garden stopped being just a source of sustenance and started being a symbol of human intellect. You weren't just growing food, you were demonstrating a theory. You were proving, in leaf and soil, that mankind was not a passive victim of a messy creation, but an active participant, a co-creator with the divine, capable of discerning and imposing universal order. This new confidence bled from the pages of books into the very soil. The discovery of perspective in painting, that clever trick of making a flat surface recede into infinite distance, didn't just stay on the canvas. It leapt out the window. Garden designers became obsessed with creating real perspective. Those long, straight allays? They are forced perspective lines, converging on a distant point, a statue, a temple, a dramatic view, making your relatively modest estate feel like it extended to the horizon. The garden became a 3D application of an artistic principle. You are literally walking into a painting. The world is no longer a flat, scary plane. It's a rational, measurable space that you can manipulate to create illusion and inspire awe. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this shift is the role of the 15th century architect and humanist Leon Battista Alberti. In his seminal work De Re Edificatoria, on the art of building, he didn't just talk about houses. He laid down the law for gardens. They must be adjacent to the house, on the same level, and designed with the same geometric principles: squares, circles, right angles. The house and garden were to be a unified, harmonious whole. The wild was officially invited in, but only on the strict condition it wore the uniform of geometry. This was the blueprint, the manifesto, the moment the garden formally enrolled in the school of mathematics. As the medieval medicinal patch evolved into the Renaissance pleasure garden, many of the old, useful plants stubbornly remained. They were just given a demotion. You'll find your sage and thyme now, but they are no longer sprawling in a messy bed. They are imprisoned. They become the low, fragrant fillers within the precisely traced knots of the parterre, their practical purposes overruled by their decorative texture and scent. The apothecary's cabinet is transformed into the painter's palette. A plant that once might have poulticed a wound is now valued because its gray-green foliage makes the perfect contrast to the darker boxwood outlining the pattern. Its utility is aestheticized. It's a promotion in beauty, but a demotion in purpose, a fragrant prisoner in a green geometric jail. And this brings us to a subtle but fierce scholarly debate that hums beneath the gravel of every path. Historians still argue whether this shift from chaotic utility to ordered beauty was a purely elite, intellectual movement, or if it reflected a deeper, more widespread change in the human relationship to the natural world. Was it just rich men showing off their new classical education, or was it a genuine, collective sigh of relief, a feeling that the world was no longer a terrifying mystery, but a comprehensible system? Were the gardens a cause of this new confidence, or merely its most visible symptom? As you leave the imagined medieval mud and return to the crisp edge of the cardinal's parterre, run your fingers along the top of that perfect hedge. Is it the edge of a new world, or just a very expensive fence? Your fingers trace the crisp, shoulder-high wall of greenery. It's not a random hedge. It's a line. A perfect, uninterrupted, mathematical line. And as you walk alongside it, you realize it doesn't just meander. It turns, with a sharp, clean, 90-degree angle. You've arrived at a corner. You look down the new path it creates, and there, perhaps 100 paces away, it intersects with another green wall, forming another flawless right angle. This is the grammar of the Renaissance garden, the square, the rectangle, the grid. But look closer at the parterre at your feet. Within its larger square frame, the boxwood is clipped into sinuous, interlocking curves, forming shapes that seem to flow. Circles, semicircles, spirals. This is the other half of the grammar, the circle, the arc, the sphere. These aren't arbitrary decorative choices. You are literally standing on a page from a sacred geometry textbook. Every shape is a symbol, an echo of a perfect, divine mind, and the gardeners who trimmed them were performing a kind of green liturgy. Let's start with the square. In this new, humanist worldview, the square represented the earthly, the terrestrial, the four elements, earth, air, fire, water, the four humors, the four seasons. It was stable, solid, rational. It was the shape of the house, the piazza, the fortified city. To impose a square upon the land was to declare it civilized, measured, and safe. The grid of paths dividing the garden into smaller squares or rectangles was an act of intellectual colonization. It said, "This land is known. It is catalogued. It is under management." You can see this in the very word quarter, used for garden sections. It's about dividing something whole into rational, controllable parts. When you stroll these paths, you are not wandering, you are auditing a green ledger. But the circle was the shape of heaven, of the divine, of perfection without beginning or end. Plato described the cosmos as a series of rotating crystalline spheres. The circle symbolized unity, eternity, and the soul. So when a Renaissance garden designer laid out a circular fountain at the intersection of major paths, or carved a giardino segreto, a secret garden, into a round form, he was placing a piece of the celestial into the earthly grid. He was creating a point of transcendence. The famous labyrinth, often built from tall hedges, was almost always circular, a winding, confusing path that ultimately led to a singular, central point. The journey through confusion to a serene center was an allegory for the human journey toward God, all mapped out in yew and hornbeam. The mainstream historical fact here is the direct pipeline from ancient Roman architectural theory, specifically Vitruvius, to the Renaissance garden. Vitruvius stated that sacred buildings should be based on perfect geometry because these shapes mirrored the order of the universe. Renaissance thinkers, treating the garden as a sacred, philosophical space, applied this rule wholesale. The garden became a microcosm, a tiny, perfect model of the macrocosm, the great big universe. The square of the earth, the circle of the heavens, all represented in a nobleman's backyard. When you look down from that terrace, you're not just looking at a pretty pattern, you're looking at a diagram of creation itself, a belief system rendered in rosemary and box. Amongst all this lofty geometry, there was a bizarre and persistent obsession with the art of the maze or labyrinth. But not just any maze. Some of the most prized were multicursal mazes, hedges with multiple paths, dead ends, and tricks. And here's the strange part. Contemporary accounts suggest they were sometimes used for romantic rendezvous and illicit games. The very structure meant to symbolize the arduous path to spiritual truth became, in practice, a playful, private space for earthly flirtation and mischief. A lord might design a philosophically profound circular labyrinth, only for his guests to use it as an elaborate, green-walled hide-and-seek board for amorous pursuits. The high-minded symbolism was constantly being undercut by very human behavior. The path to heaven, it seems, had some very earthly detours. This leads us directly to an open, and rather delightful, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the designers and owners truly internalized this complex sacred symbolism with pious depth, or if it was largely a fashionable intellectual veneer, a way to show off one's education and piety, like wearing the latest philosophical trend. Was the cardinal, as he showed off his circular fountain, genuinely contemplating the eternal spheres, or was he thinking, "This will absolutely impress the Pope when he visits next week"? Were these gardens profound theological statements, or were they the Renaissance equivalent of putting a fake philosophy book on your coffee table? The truth likely lies in a messy blend of both, which is, ironically, the least geometrical shape of all. The desire to appear profound is, itself, a very human shape. To turn a philosophy into a hedge, you need more than just big ideas. You need force. You need leverage. You need tools that look less like gardening implements and more like surgical instruments for arboreal torture. So let's step off the pristine gravel path and into the gardener's shed, a dim, earthy-smelling space that would make a modern DIY enthusiast blanch. This is where the abstract geometry of the terrace meets the brutal, physical reality of branch and sap. The air is thick with the scent of linseed oil, sharpened metal, and sweat. On the walls, hanging from hooks, is an arsenal of control. You are about to meet the unsung, calloused hands that would enact the cardinal's green dream, and the vicious little helpers they wielded. First, the shears. Not the light, aluminum-handled ones you might have in your garage. These are monsters. Forged iron, with long, straight blades like the beak of a giant, vengeful bird. The handles are oak, worn smooth and dark from the grip of generations of giardinieri. They are heavy. Using them for an hour would turn your forearms to burning jelly. They are for the bold, sweeping cuts, for defining the major planes of a hedge. But for the fine work, the broderie, the embroidery of the parterre, you need something more precise. Enter the forbici seep, smaller shears with shorter, often curved blades, for snipping intricate shapes. They are the scalpels to the larger shears cleavers. Every snip must be deliberate, a cut not just of a leaf, but of a line in the designer's mental blueprint. But shears alone can't create a perfect sphere or a clean, architectural cube. For that, you need a template. And here's where things get wonderfully, ridiculously contrived. You'll see strange wooden frames, a half circle of bent wood on a stick, or a cubical cage of thin laths. The gardener would hold this frame against the burgeoning green shrub, and then snip away everything that protruded beyond its bounds. It was tracing, but in 3 dimensions. They'd use lengths of string, soaked in chalk or pigment, stretched taut between stakes to mark straight lines on the leafy canvas before cutting. They even had specialized rasp, large, coarse files, for smoothing down any stubborn, knobby bits of wood left after a major cut. This wasn't gardening, it was topiary taxidermy. The mainstream historical fact to cling to here is the sheer specialization of labor. The head gardener, the capo giardinier, might have understood the grand design, but the men under him were specialists. One team did nothing but edge the parterres. Another, stronger crew handled the major hedging. The waterers were a guild unto themselves, managing the complex fontainieri, fountain makers, and the labyrinth of lead pipes and clay conduits. The man shaping the dolphin topiary likely did nothing but shape that dolphin, year after year, his entire identity wrapped up in the maintenance of a green marine mammal. His world was the smell of privet leaves and the feel of the wooden dolphin form under his fingers, not the philosophical musings of his employer in the palazzo. While wood was common, some of the most elaborate templates, especially for complex heraldic beasts or coats of arms rendered in greenery, were made from wire. And not just any wire. This was the pre-industrial era. The wire was often iron, hand-drawn, expensive, and incredibly rigid. But the real problem? It heated up. Under the blistering Italian sun, a wire frame wrapped around a yew bush could become searingly hot, burning the plant's tender new growth and literally branding the design into the leaves. Some garden manuals actually advised shading the frames during the hottest part of the day, or timing the trimming for early morning, not just for the comfort of the gardener, but to prevent cooking the very masterpiece you were trying to create. It was a constant battle between the ideal, rigid form and the living, breathing, surprisingly fragile material. This practice of such intense, form-driven trimming opens up a rich vein of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the development of these specialized tools drove the complexity of the designs, or if the ambitious designs necessitated the invention of the tools. Was it a case of I have a new, sharper shear, so now I can try a more intricate pattern? Or was it the cardinal wants a labyrinth based on the Cretan myth, by God, find a way to build a wooden minotaur frame? It's the eternal question of technology and art. Does the tool shape the vision, or does the vision demand the tool? In this shed, surrounded by these brutal, beautiful instruments, you can feel it was probably a frantic, sweaty feedback loop of both. The designer's imagination constantly bumped against the limits of iron, wood, and biology, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer was the sound of those limits being stretched, one snip at a time. The tools are forged, the philosophy is set. But a garden this precise doesn't sprout from the earth fully formed like some geometric Athena. It has to be drafted. Before a single spade breaks the soil, before a single hedge seedling is tremblingly planted, it exists as lines on paper. So let's leave the sweaty shed and step into a very different room, a quiet, sunlit studiolo. The air smells of parchment, ink, and citrus oil. A man, not a laborer, sits at a broad desk. His hands are stained not with soil, but with silver paint and ink. Before him is a large sheet of paper, and on it, with a compass and a straight edge, he is drawing the garden you will later walk. He is not a gardener. He is an architect. And his pen is the first, and most important, tool of all. This is the revolutionary idea, the garden as architecture. The man at the desk, a figure like Leon Battista Alberti or later, Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola, saw no firm boundary between the house and the land. The house was an interior volume of ordered space. The garden was to be an exterior volume of ordered space. Walls became hedges. Ceilings became leafy canopies. Doorways became arbors. Flooring became intricate parterres. The garden was a series of green rooms, and it had to be planned with the same rigorous draftsmanship as a palace. The compass was, describing perfect circles for future fountains or giardini segreti. The straight edge scrapes, ruling the lines for future allays that will vanish to a calculated point. This is the birth of the garden plan, and it represents a fundamental shift from experimental, hands-in-the-dirt knowledge to abstract, theoretical design. The mainstream historical fact that codified this was Alberti's previously mentioned De Re Edificatoria. He wrote, "The garden should be surrounded by a high wall, and divided into squares by box-edged paths. There should be arbors of honeysuckle and vines, and a variety of evergreen trees, planted in straight lines." Notice the language: surrounded, divided, planted in straight lines. This is the language of construction, of partitioning space, not of nurturing growth. His providing specifications, like an engineer. This text became the Bible for every wealthy patron who wanted to be modern. The designer at the desk wasn't just making something pretty. He was solving a spatial problem according to classical principles. His primary relationship was with geometry, not with geraniums. They were often stunning works of art in themselves, rendered in beautiful ink and wash, sometimes even painted. But they were also often hopelessly optimistic. The neat little squares representing trees didn't account for the tree that grew lopsided toward the sun. The perfect circles for fountains didn't factor in the spring that proved to have half the expected flow. The design assumed a flat, featureless plane, not the stubborn hillock or the inconveniently placed ancient oak that the actual site presented. Many a gorgeous plan was, in the execution, a series of frantic compromises between the ideal on paper and the reality of the lumpy, watery, living earth. The architect, in his clean studiolo, was designing for a platonic ideal of land. The capo giardinier had to translate that ideal into a world of clay, rocks, and eccentric root systems. The plan was the commandment. The garden was the often heretical translation. This friction between the ideal plan and the messy reality fuels an ongoing scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these architectural plans were meant as strict, literal blueprints to be followed to the millimeter, or more as evocative concepts, a visual pitch to the patron of the idea of the garden, with the understanding that the head gardener would have significant interpretative license. Was the drawn circle of the hedge meant to be perfectly round, or was roundish good enough once you were out there with a frame and some shears? Given the technological limits of surveying and the variability of plants, a slavish adherence to the plan was likely impossible. The truth probably lived in the muddy middle. The plan set the authoritative language, but the head gardener spoke the dialect. He was the translator of theory into leaf, and every translation loses something, or adds a little something new. So as you stand on the cardinal's terrace, looking down at the living geometry, understand you are not looking at a spontaneous creation. You are looking at a drawing that has somehow conjured itself into 3 dimensions. Every line you see was first a line of ink, ruled by a steady hand guided not by horticultural instinct, but by mathematical principle. The garden is a slow, green echo of a swift, dark scratch on parchment. The mind conceived it. The muscles and the shears argued it into existence. And the gap between those 2 acts, between the compass's perfect arc and the hedge's slightly fuzzy curve, is where the real, human, untidy history lives. The plan is approved. The ink is dry. Now, it needs a bank account the size of a small nation to breathe it into life. So let's follow that plan to its most spectacular, debt-inducing realization. We're leaving the theoretical studiolo and arriving at the foot of the Pitti Palace in Florence, in the mid-16th century. The air is different here. It's still scented with lemon and box, but it's laced with something else. The palpable smell of power, and the sweat of 1,000 laborers. You're entering the Boboli Gardens, the ultimate green calling card of the Medici family. This isn't just a garden, it's a political statement in topiary, an economic engine of prestige, and a sprawling, open-air theatre where the performance is Medici magnificence. And every single, perfectly trimmed hedge is a line in their ledger of influence. You enter not through a humble gate, but up a monumental staircase, the amphitheatre carved into the hillside before you. But it's not stone, not yet. In its first incarnation, it's grass and greenery, a bowl of living emerald. This is the key. The Medici, having cemented their power as Grand Dukes, needed a stage to display it. The garden was that stage. The amphitheatre hosted lavish entertainments, plays, concerts, mock naval battles, even the first operas. The audience? Every ambassador, every rival noble, every artist and thinker whose favor they courted. From their seats on the grassy slopes, guests would look up at the palace, and down at the spectacle, literally surrounded by Medici control. The message was non-verbal but deafening. We command not just art and finance, but nature itself. Our order creates beauty. Our wealth creates leisure. You are inside our masterpiece. The mainstream historical fact that underpins Boboli is its role as a botanical status symbol. This was the age of global exploration. New plants were flooding into Europe from the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Having them first was a megaflex. The Medici created one of the earliest Giardini dei Semplici, botanical gardens, within Boboli, a walled enclosure where rare and exotic plants were studied, catalogued, and most importantly, shown off. A Peruvian potato flower might be ugly, but its rarity was beautiful. A bed of Turkish tulips, before they crashed the market, was a display of unparalleled global reach and connections. Trimming a hedge was one thing. Possessing a living specimen that no one else in Italy had was another level of prestige altogether. The garden became a living museum of conquest and commerce. Among the statuary placed with such care along the paths, gods, emperors, allegorical figures, the Medici placed statues of dwarfs. Specifically, court dwarfs, like the famous Morgante, Cosimo I's favored dwarf. He was depicted, famously, riding a giant tortoise. These statues were not placed as cruel jokes, but as signs of the Duke's magnificenza, his ability to curate and control all wonders of the world, the human oddities as well as the botanical ones. It was a possession, rendered in stone. The dwarf statue, sitting amidst the perfect geometry, is a jarring reminder that this entire landscape was a collection, and people, too, could be collectibles in the cabinet of curiosity that was the Medici court. The hedge trimmed you into its logic, whether you were a plant, a peasant, or a privileged courtier. This practice of using the garden as a political and economic ledger opens a clear scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary function of gardens like Boboli was political, to intimidate and impress rivals, or economic, to literally cultivate new crops and demonstrate commercial prowess. Was it a boardroom or a laboratory? A stage for power or a testing ground for profit? The answer, of course, is both, but the balance is everything. The exotic pomegranate in the Giardino dei Semplici was a scientific curiosity, a potential new food source, and a bragging right. The lavender in the parterre was beautiful, bee-friendly, and a cash crop for the perfume industry. Every leaf worked overtime, aesthetic, political, economic. The Medici didn't just have green thumbs, they had spreadsheet fingers, and they were calculating the return on investment for every clipped boxwood blade. So as you walk the steep, cypress-lined Viotalone Avenue in Boboli, feeling the scale of it crush your sense of self, remember you are walking through a calculated risk. The millions of florins poured into moving earth, piping water, and paying shearmen were not spent for personal tranquility. They were a strategic investment in soft power. The perfectly trimmed hedge was the sharp edge of a very sophisticated weapon. It said, "My order is so absolute, it extends to the very shrubs. My wealth is so vast, I can afford to employ 100 men to make leaves grow in squares. My taste is so impeccable, even nature agrees with me." In this garden, a stray branch wasn't just untidy, it was a crack in the facade of state. Walking these paths, you start to see the patterns aren't just patterns. The shapes aren't just shapes. That laurel hedge clipped into a dense, dark wall isn't just a boundary. It's a symbol of glory and poetry, sacred to Apollo. That lone, towering cypress, pruned to a sharp, dark spear pointing at the sky, isn't just a tree. It's a symbol of mourning, of eternity, of the soul's ascent. The garden has stopped speaking the language of mere geometry and started whispering in the coded tongue of allegory. Every snip, every planting, every piece of strategically placed statuary is a word in a silent, green poem. You are no longer in a park. You are in a three-dimensional emblem book, and to understand it, you need a decoder ring for classical mythology, Christian symbolism, and family politics. Let's start with the obvious. The gods are here. A statue of Venus, goddess of love, placed not randomly, but at the end of a secluded, rose-covered bower, transforms that space into a locus amenus, a pleasant place for amorous dalliance and refined conversation about love. A statue of Hercules, the demigod of strength, placed at the entrance to a grove, signals that what lies beyond is a place of trials or heroic contemplation, perhaps a labyrinth. The garden becomes a stage set for the patron to play out, in his mind, the roles of these ancient figures. He isn't just Cosimo de' Medici walking to his fountain. In that moment, he is Apollo, patron of the arts, approaching his sacred grove. The hedge is the proscenium arch. But the symbolism cuts deeper than classical cosplay. Plants themselves held potent meanings, a language called the language of flowers long before the Victorian era got hold of it. The ivy entwining a column meant fidelity and eternal attachment. The evergreen boxwood symbolized immortality and, ironically given its use in borders, also stoicism, standing firm and contained. A grove of oak trees spoke of Jupiter's power and wisdom. Even the lowly strawberry plant, with its three-part leaf and red fruit, was a Christian symbol for the Trinity and the drops of Christ's blood. A parterre wasn't just a pretty knot, it was a theological argument written in chlorophyll. The mainstream historical fact here is the Renaissance obsession with imprises, personal emblems or devices that combined an image and a motto to represent a person's character or aspirations. Gardens were littered with them. A fountain with a statue of a tortoise with a sail on its back, the impresa of Cosimo I, meant festina lent, make haste slowly. The living garden became a canvas for these personal logos, a branded environment centuries before corporate landscaping. Amongst all this high-minded symbolism, there was a vein of playful, even risk, coding. The garden, especially the Giardino Segreto, the secret garden, was a private space, away from the public spectacle of the main parterres. Here, the symbolism could get spicy. The pineapple, a newly discovered and incredibly rare fruit, became a not-so-subtle symbol of welcome. And by welcome, we mean hospitality of a very intimate nature, due to its phallic shape and crown. A fountain featuring a naughty nymph or a satyr wasn't just a classical reference, it was a wink. Some scholars suggest that the maze itself, with its hidden center, was a metaphor for the female anatomy. and the journey through it an allegory for seduction. So, while the cardinal was on the main terrace contemplating the circles of heaven, his younger nephew might be in the secret garden, getting a very different, earthier education from the topiary. This loud, often contradictory symbolism, sacred and profane, public and private, feeds directly into a rich scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the dense symbolic program of these gardens was meant to be read and understood in its entirety by contemporary visitors, or if it was a kind of glorious, overwhelming display of erudition meant to simply impress with its depth, whether fully grasped or not. Could a visiting diplomat actually parse all the mythological, heraldic, and botanical references as he strolled? Or was the intended effect more like, "Blimey, there's a lot of learned stuff here, the Duke must be brilliantly smart"? Was it a puzzle to be solved, or a fog of prestige to be wandered through in awe? The garden, in its silence, withholds the answer, leaving only the teasing symbols, green and growing, laughing in the sun. The symbolism is set, the vision is grand. But how do you ensure the guy with the shears, the one with dirt under his nails and sweat on his brow, doesn't misinterpret the poet's laurel or the philosopher's circle? You don't leave it to chance. You don't trust oral tradition. You write it down. You codify it. So let's step into the library now, a place quieter than the garden but humming with its own kind of authority. The scent is dust, leather, and the faint, acidic tang of iron gall ink. On a heavy oak table lies an open book, not a philosophical tome, but a manual. Its title might be something like Illinois Giardino del Recreation or part of a larger work on estate management. This is the rule book. The garden, from dream to directive, becomes a series of instructions. The living world enters the age of the specification sheet. These manuals are fascinatingly, ruthlessly precise. They don't just say plant a hedge. They dictate the species: box for low parterres, Buxus sempervirens sufruticosa, yew or hornbeam for tall walls, Taxus baccata, Carpinus betulus. They specify the dimensions. For an alley, trees shall be planted 40 paces apart, measured from the center of each trunk. They describe the planting method: dig a trench 3 times the width of the root ball, mix the earth with well-rotted manure and crushed brick for drainage. They even get into the nitty-gritty: recipes for plant washes to kill blight, instructions for storing bulbs over winter, and elaborate, often useless, concoctions to encourage growth. A typical one involved steeping dung in rainwater for a lunar cycle. The smell must have been apocalyptic. The garden is broken down into a series of repeatable, controllable tasks. The mainstream historical fact embodied by these manuals is the rise of empirical knowledge and its dissemination through print. The Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering ancients. It was about observing, recording, and sharing new knowledge. Gardening manuals, often written by practicing head gardeners or keen amateurs, collected centuries of practical, hands-on wisdom that had been guild secrets and bundled it with the new architectural theory. For the first time, a nobleman in England could read about how to build an Italian-style parterre, complete with plant lists and pruning schedules. It democratized the idea of the geometric garden, even if only the ultra-wealthy could afford its reality. The manual turned local, tacit knowledge into transferable, technical data. The obsessive focus on permanence. These gardens were meant to be eternal testaments to their creators. The manuals, therefore, are full of anxious advice on how to cheat time and entropy. One common theme? Preventing gaps. The horror of a bare spot in your perfect boxwood knot. Authors advised planting seedlings incredibly close together, almost root to root, and then mercilessly thinning the weakest later. They prescribed rigorous, twice-yearly clipping schedules not just for shape, but to encourage dense, twiggy interior growth that would resist dying back. Some even recommended a brutal practice called plashing or pleaching for hedges, partially cutting and intertwining the living branches of adjacent trees so they would graft together, forming a literally unbreakable, living lattice. The ideal garden was not just orderly, it was meant to be immortal, a frozen green moment. The manual was its preservation recipe. This leads to a subtle but critical scholarly debate centered on these very texts. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of gardening manuals standardized Renaissance garden design into a homogeneous, pan-European style, or if they simply provided a common vocabulary that was then adapted to wildly different local climates, materials, and tastes. Did the manual from Tuscany create cookie-cutter gardens across France, Germany, and England? Or did a German lord read it, throw up his hands at the impossibility of growing Mediterranean citrus outdoors, and tell his gardener to use hardy local spruce instead, inventing a new, regional style in the process? The manuals provided the grammar, but the local dialect of soil, weather, and available plants determined the accent. The book on the table was a starting point, but the earth outside always had the final edit. So as you imagine the capo giardinier poring over a manual by candlelight, his rough finger tracing the lines of text, understand he is at a crossroads. He is consulting centralized authority, but his daily battle is with localized reality. The book says plant in April. But if April is cold and wet, does he wait? The book says use crushed marble for white paths. But if there's only local limestone, will the Duke notice the difference? The manual sought to eliminate the gardener's discretion, to make him a mere executor of a pre-written script. But the garden, being alive, constantly demanded improvisation. The true story is in the margin notes, the splashes of mud on the parchment, the silent decisions made when the book was closed and the clouds gathered on the horizon. The manuals are stern, the plans are flawless. But parchment doesn't sweat. Ink doesn't get blisters. So let's finally meet the human engine behind the green geometry. Step away from the library, away from the terrace, and down into the trench, literally. It's an hour before dawn, and the air is chill. You're with the giardinieri, the army of the earth. Their world is not one of philosophy or symbolism. Their world is the ache in the lower back, the permanent grime etched into knuckle crevices, the rhythmic, mind-numbing snick-snick-snick of shears from first light until the bell tolls the end of the day. They are the human machine, the cogs in the clockwork of paradise, and their reality is a universe apart from the leisurely stroll of their master. Your hands, in this imagined journey, are no longer soft. They are calloused, the nails broken and blackened. Your clothes are coarse linen, smelling of soil, green sap, and your own stale sweat. Your day is governed by tasks, not the sun's poetic passage. One team is on water duty, a brutal exercise in hauling. While the garden might have ingenious hydraulic systems for the showpiece fountains, the thousands of new seedlings and thirsty parterres are watered by hand, from wells, from canals, with heavy leather buckets on wooden yokes that grind into your collarbone. Another team is trenching, double digging new borders to the exact depth specified in the manual, their spades striking sparks off flints in the soil. The most skilled, the topiarii, work on the intricate shapes, their faces a mask of concentration, their movements small and precise. They are the artists, but artists paid by the day, whose masterpiece is owned by someone else before the first cut is made. The mainstream historical fact here is the rigid, often cruel, social hierarchy. The head gardener, the capo, might dine in the servants' hall and have the patron's ear on garden matters. He was management. But you, the day laborer, are disposable muscle. Your pay is meager, you're housing a shade cot in a damp outbuilding. Your relationship with the beauty you create is purely antagonistic. That perfect, velvety lawn is your enemy. because you are the one who has to weed it, on your knees, inch by inch, under a punishing sun. That sublime hedge is your tyrant, because it will grow again, and you will have to trim it again, in a cycle as endless as it is invisible to the Lord who admires its static perfection. The garden's illusion of timeless order is built on the foundation of repetitive, timed labor. Garden theft. It was rampant. And not just theft of fruit. We're talking about the plants themselves. Given the astronomical cost of rare specimens, a single tulip bulb at the height of tulip mania could cost a mansion. The garden was a vault of living treasure. Laborers were often searched on their way out. But the manuals also warn of a more subtle theft: cuttings. A skilled gardener could sneak a small clipping of a prized rosemary or a slip of a unique rose, root it at home in his village plot, and either sell it or grow his own little piece of prestige. It was a silent, green rebellion. The Duke's proprietary control over nature literally seeping out through the pockets of his underpaid staff. The geometric order of the garden, it turns out, had a black market. This daily grind of the unnamed many fuels a persistent and important scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the degree of agency, or even creative input, these laborers might have had. Were they truly mindless automata, following the plan and the manual to the letter? Or did the capo, and even the laborers, through their intimate, tactile knowledge of the land's quirks, where the frost pooled, which wore reflected heat, subtly alter the design on the ground? Did the man who spent 10 hours a year shaping the peacock have a say in how the tail feathers curled? The records are silent. The patrons and architects wrote the histories. But logic suggests that expertise, however lowly, must have whispered advice. The perfect geometry, when it met a stubborn rock or a sickly plant, had to adapt. And the man with the shovel was the first to know. His agency might have been the agency of the footnote, the slight adjustment that allowed the grand text to make sense. So as you hear the distant snick-snick from the bosque, don't just hear the sound of order being maintained. Hear the sound of a bargain being struck. The laborer trades his strength, his time, his aching back, for a pittance. The garden, in return, gives him nothing of its beauty, but perhaps a secret clipping, a pocketful of windfall fruit, or just the grim satisfaction of knowing the soil's secrets that the Lord on the terrace will never understand. They are the ghosts in the machine, the human price of a perfect angle, their breath the invisible wind that stirs the leaves of the mathematical dream. For all the control exerted over leaf and branch, the Renaissance mind knew one element was both the ultimate symbol of life and the most defiantly chaotic: water. It could not be clipped. It could not be planted in rows. It could seep, flood, stagnate, or simply refuse to flow. Taming it became the supreme engineering challenge, the final proof that human ingenuity could master nature's most fluid force. So, let's follow the sound, the distant, chuckling whisper that has underpinned our stroll from the start. Let's walk to the heart of the garden, to the fountain. But don't just look at the pretty marble nymph or the leaping dolphin. Look behind her. Understand that her graceful, arching jet is not a natural spring's burble. It's a feat of hydraulic coercion. It's water, arguing in the language of physics. The principle was deceptively simple: gravity. Water seeks its own level. The genius, and the back-breaking expense, was in the manipulation of that fact. To make water dance in your garden, you first had to capture it from a source higher than your garden, a spring on a distant hillside, a diverted stream. Then you had to transport it, often via a hidden, underground aqueduct of clay pipes or hollowed-out stone, maintaining a constant, gentle downhill slope. Gradient, they'd learn, was everything. Any dip would create a dreaded airlock. Any too steep drop would cause violent pressure that could burst your pipes. This hidden, subterranean network was the garden's true nervous system, more vital than any path. It was a secret geography of flow, a buried mathematics of slope and volume. The mainstream historical spectacle was the giochi d'acqua, water jokes. These weren't ha-ha jokes, but gotcha jokes. The Bobble-Eye Gardens and Villa d'Este at Tivoli were famous for them. You'd be strolling a peaceful path when, triggered by a hidden step or a lever pulled by a grinning servant, a hidden nozzle would spray you from the ankle, or an arch of water would drench you from a seemingly dry grotto ceiling. It was a controlled, mischievous reversal of the total control. The patron, showing off his mastery over nature, could choose to momentarily unleash a tiny, playful chaos upon his guests. It was power demonstrating it could afford to be playful, that its control was so absolute it could simulate wildness for a laugh. The water jet was the period's equivalent of a remote-controlled whoopee cushion, costing thousands of scudi. The full-time fontainier, or fountain keeper. His job was less poetic and more like being a plumber for the gods. His tools were rods for clearing blockages, wrenches for adjusting bronze nozzles, and a deep, intuitive understanding of water pressure. His most hated enemy? Calcaire. Lime scale. The mineral deposits from hard water would slowly, inexorably crust the inside of pipes and the tiny orifices of fountain jets, diminishing the flow, distorting the perfect arc of water. Manuals describe painstaking cleaning processes using vinegar and arduous scraping with wire brushes. But the real battle was biological, algae. The sunlit, nutrient-rich water in basins was a paradise for green slime. The fontainier would have to drain and scrub the fountains regularly, a never-ending, Sisyphus-like task. The most perfect geometric jet was, in truth, only moments away from becoming a dribble or a green, murky pond. This intricate, high-maintenance relationship with water opens the valve on a clear scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these elaborate hydraulic systems was symbolic, to display mastery over nature's wildest element, or practical, for irrigation of the vast plantings. Was the dancing fountain the end goal, with irrigation a handy byproduct? Or was the reliable watering of the Giardino dei Semplici and the kitchen garden the real objective, with the fancy fountains just a flashy public display of the system's capability? It's the old profit versus prestige debate, but with plumbing. The answer is, again, both, but the balance tells you about the patron. A more pragmatic duke might have a simpler, more efficient system for his orchards. A purely show-off cardinal might have spectacular, water-wasting giochi that required a separate, dedicated aqueduct, leaving his vegetable plots to be watered the old-fashioned way, by the aching backs of the bucket brigade. So, as you stand before the grand fountain, watching the water catch the light in a perfect, glittering arc, see beyond the beauty. See the hidden calculus. See the surveyor on the distant hill, the teams of diggers laying pipes by the mile, the fontainier on his knees with his vinegar jug. That glittering jet is a monument to applied mathematics, a celebration of gravity harnessed, of chaos funneled into a predictable, beautiful shape. It is the final, liquid proof that in this garden, nothing, not even the most fluid and changeable element, is left to its own devices. The water has been given its lines, and it performs them over and over, until the lime scale wins. The garden has offered geometry, symbolism, and engineered wonders. Now, it demands an audience. Not just strollers, but spectators. It's time for a performance. So let's return to that grassy amphitheater in the Bobble-Eye, but now it's twilight. 1,000 flickering torches and oil lamps push back the night, their smoke mingling with the scent of orange blossom and perfume. The seats are filling with silks and velvets. But the stage isn't built of wood. It's built of hedge. You're about to attend a performance in a Teatro di Verdura, a theater of greenery. The garden, already a picture, now becomes a living proscenium, and it's perfect, Clipped forms serve as both set and silent, leafy actors in the drama of power and pleasure. Imagine the play is a pastoral, a fashionable genre where shepherds and nymphs recite verses about unrequited love and the virtues of the simple life. The irony is delicious. The most complex, expensive, artificial environment imaginable is the setting for a celebration of rustic simplicity. The hedge-walled stage might have painted backdrops flown in, but its permanent architecture is arboreal. The wings are openings in a tall yew wall. The royal box is a raised, turf-covered bank, often adorned with more topiary. The audience sits on grassy slopes. The actors' voices carry in the open air, bouncing off the green walls. This is entertainment literally rooted in the land of the patron, a direct, physical metaphor. His domain provides not just food and beauty, but culture itself. The mainstream historical fact here is the garden as a venue for the nascent art of opera. In fact, many musicologists believe the very structure of early opera, with its intermezzi, musical interludes, and emphasis on spectacle over deep narrative, was perfectly suited to the garden setting. The first operas, like Jacopo Peri's Daphne, were performed in Florentine palaces, but the move outdoors was natural. The garden provided the mythological setting ready-made. A real grotto could serve as the cave of a sorceress. A long alley could be the path of a hero's journey. The hydraulic engineers could even orchestrate water effects on cue. The garden was the original multimedia experience. Music, poetry, living scenery, and special effects, all funded and contained by the host. The soundscape. We think of these gardens as silent but for fountains and birds. During a performance, that changed. Beyond the actors and musicians, there was a constant, rustling, coughing, murmuring backdrop, the audience. But also, the garden itself. Paper lanterns would flutter in the breeze. The torch flames would hiss. More practically, the thick hedges acted as a baffle, dampening external noise but also creating weird acoustic pockets. An actor might have to project toward a leafy wall that absorbed sound, while a whisper backstage could be heard clearly in a nearby bosque. And let's not forget the wildlife. A performance could be interrupted by the frantic screech of a peacock, a common garden status symbol bird, or the sudden, loud flutter of pigeons disturbed from their roost in the ilex trees. The living set was not always a cooperative cast member. This use of the garden as a theatrical space sparks a nuanced scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these entertainments were primarily about community building among the elite, a shared, exclusive cultural experience that reinforced group identity, or about competitive display. My theater, my production, is more lavish than my rivals. Was it about bringing the court together, or about one-upping the other noble who only had a modest Teatro di Verdura with one fountain? The enormous expense, commissioning musicians, poets, costumes, and building temporary stage machinery, suggests competition was a fierce motivator. But the act of sitting together in the darkening garden, sharing in the ephemeral magic of a play, also created powerful social bonds. The garden theatre was likely the crucible where community and competition melted together into a single, glittering, nighttime event. So, as the curtain of dusk falls and the first lute notes hang in the fragrant air, look around. The perfect geometry has served its daytime purpose of impressing with order. Now, under torchlight, it serves a new one, to frame fantasy. The hedges are no longer just lines of control, they are the wings of a dream. The patron, sitting in his box, is no longer just a landowner, he is a producer, an impresario of illusion. And for a few hours, the mathematical garden transcends its own logic. It isn't about asserting control anymore. It's about offering escape, a meticulously planned, hydraulically sound, perfectly trimmed escape into a story. The shears have created the silence, so that the poetry can be heard. But no dream, however expensive, lasts forever. Under the torchlight and behind the perfect facade, the cracks are beginning to show. You notice them first as absences. A brown patch in the parterre where the box blight has crept in. A statue with a missing nose, not from classical wear, but from frost heave. The faint, sulphurous smell of a blocked drain near the grotto, where the clever water joke has sprung a leak. The Renaissance garden, for all its bravado, was a perpetual war against entropy, and entropy is an insidious, patient enemy. It's time to look at the descent, the decay, and the gathering voices that whispered this whole geometric enterprise was, perhaps, a bit much. First, the internal contradictions. The very plants used to create this eternal order had their own ideas. Boxwood, the parterre darling, is slow-growing but prone to sudden dieback. Yew, perfect for tall hedges, is toxic, and its berries attracted birds who then decorated the pristine gravel with purple, staining droppings. The exotic treasures in the Giardino dei Semplici would often just die, unable to adjust to the climate, their expensive demise a quiet embarrassment. And then there was the topiary pushed to its grotesque extreme. While tasteful spheres and cones were one thing, the fashion for creating green ships, coats of arms, or entire hunting scenes in foliage struck some as ludicrous. The writer and agronomist Giovan Vittorio Soderini, in the late 16th century, mocked those who take pleasure in seeing beasts, giants, and other bizarre things shaped in their gardens, calling it a childish diversion from a garden's true, productive purpose. The line between sublime art and ridiculous kitsch was as thin as a new leaf. The mainstream historical pressure, however, came from outside the garden walls. The Protestant Reformation, boiling across northern Europe, brought with it a deep suspicion of Catholic pomp, visual spectacle, and what was seen as idolatrous luxury. To a Calvinist eye, the Italianate garden wasn't a symbol of divine order. It was a monument to papist vanity and wasteful extravagance. The geometric garden became politically and religiously coded. As this aesthetic traveled north, it was adapted, often simplified. In England, during the Civil War, many formal gardens associated with the royalist aristocracy were deliberately destroyed by parliamentary troops, not just for strategic reasons, but as ideological statements. The hedges were torn up not as gardening, but as iconoclasm. The very order that signified power in Italy could signify corruption in England. The role of the herbalist versus the gardener. While the gardener fought for perfect form, the herbalist or simple keeper was concerned with the plant's essence, its virtues, its medicinal or culinary properties. In their view, the obsessive clipping and shaping could actually sap a plant's strength, diverting its energy from producing potent flowers, seeds, or oils into just making more boring leaves. A lavishly trimmed sage bush, they might argue, was a less potent sage bush. There was a quiet, philosophical conflict between the garden as a picture and the garden as a pharmacy. One prioritized the eye, the other the body. This tension lives on today in the debate between ornamental and practical gardening, between the lawn and the vegetable patch. All of this friction fuels a pivotal scholarly debate about the end of the High Renaissance style. Historians still argue whether the formal garden's decline in the 18th century was primarily due to changing aesthetic fashion, the rise of the English landscape garden with its faux natural curves, or due to deeper economic and social realities, the crippling cost of maintenance, the shift in wealth, the new philosophical embrace of nature as a guide, not an adversary. Was it that people just got bored of triangles and started liking wiggly lines? Or was it that the bankrupt noble could no longer pay the army of giardinieri, and the intellectual, post-Newtonian world began to see untamed nature itself as the true expression of divine geometry? The cracks in the parterre were both literal and metaphorical. The weeds of new ideas were sprouting in the gravel. So, as you walk the path now, see the duality. See the proud cypress, but also the moss staining its base. Hear the fountain, but also the croak of a frog in the algae-tinged basin. The garden is still magnificent, but it is no longer invincible. It is a performance that is starting to tire, its actors, both human and botanical, growing weary of their endless, rehearsed roles. The desire for a different script, one with fewer lines, less shearing, and a leading role for something called nature with a capital N, is gathering like evening mist in the low parts of the garden. The age of absolute, green geometry is reaching its final, glorious, and slightly frayed act. The pendulum, having swung to its furthest point of control, begins its inevitable sweep back. The cracks you saw weren't just signs of decay, they were the birth canals of a new ideal. The 17th century curlicues of the Baroque garden, all swirling parterres and water theatres of dizzying complexity, feel like the final, feverish breath of the old regime. Its control gone rococo, order drunk on its own possibility. But as you stand amidst the hydraulic symphonies and gilded statuary of a Versailles, the ultimate, terrifying evolution of the Italian ideal, you feel a new longing. Not for more complexity, but for less. Not for the triumph over nature, but for its whispered secret. The geometric garden is about to be overthrown by its own the landscape garden. And the first, quiet mutterings of that revolution are already audible in the very bosquets designed to suppress them. First, witness the Baroque excess. It takes the Renaissance principles and injects them with steroids. The parterre isn't just a knot, it's a parterre de broderie so intricate it looks like a lace maker had a nervous breakdown. The hedges are taller, forming dense, dark rooms of greenery called bosquets, inside which you might find a secret ballroom of clipped hornbeam or a mirror-lined gallery reflecting infinity. The fountains aren't just single jets, they are towering, roaring compositions of marble and froth, like Bernini sculptures having a meltdown. Its control so absolute it becomes theatrical, overwhelming, a sensory bombardment meant to stun the visitor into submission. The mainstream historical fact here is that this style became the language of absolute monarchy, most perfectly expressed by Louis XIV at Versailles. The garden was no longer a personal studiolo. It was a diagram of the state, with every path leading to the Sun King's bedroom window. The hedge was a soldier in the army of his glory. But within this overwhelming control, the first inklings of its opposite begin to stir. On the very edges of these vast, geometric domains, often hidden from the main axial views, you'll find the jardin à l'anglaise in embryonic form, the bosque naturel. It was a section of woodland, but natural in quotes so big you could drive a carriage through them. The paths within might curve, but they were carefully raked. The trees might be allowed a looser form, but deadwood was diligently removed. It was a curated wildness, a zoo for the idea of nature. This was the pressure valve. Even the most controlling psyche needed a place to imagine an escape from control. This manufactured wilderness was the gateway drug to the full-blown landscape garden movement of the 18th century. The role of the ha-ha. This was a revolutionary, and frankly, hilarious-sounding, piece of garden infrastructure. It was a sunken fence, a ditch with a retaining wall on the garden side. From the house, you saw uninterrupted, rolling grassland flowing seamlessly to the horizon. But from the other side, in the fields, livestock were prevented from entering by the invisible barrier. The ha-ha was the ultimate visual trick. It extended the idea of the garden's control infinitely outwards, without the need for a physical wall that would interrupt the view. It was the moment the garden said, "My control is so clever, it's invisible. The landscape itself is my garden now." It was geometry denying its own edges, the first step toward dissolving the very borders it had spent 2 centuries perfecting. This monumental shift from clipped artifice to managed naturalism sparks one of the grandest scholarly debates in garden history. Historians still argue whether the English landscape garden, think capability brown sweeping away parterres to create gentle, rolling lawns and artfully placed clumps of trees, was a genuine philosophical rejection of Renaissance Baroque principles, or simply their logical evolution in a different political and economic climate. Was it a revolutionary embrace of Locke's theories of natural liberty and Shaftesbury's aesthetics of the sublime? Or was it just a cheaper way to maintain a 1,000-acre estate than paying 500 topiarists? Did the English aristocrat truly have a deeper poetic soul, or was he just better at hiding his coercion behind a ha-ha and a fake ruin? The answer, as always, is mired in the mud of both motive and practicality. The desire to look like you weren't trying so hard, it turns out, requires immense effort. So, as you stand at the border between a gargantuan Baroque parterre and a contrived wilderness, feel the tension of the age. The old order is still here, in the razor-straight lines at your back. But the new calling is there, in the contrived curve of the path before you. It's the difference between a shout and a sigh. The Renaissance shouted its order. The coming age would sigh a longing for a nature that never truly was. The shears are still in hand, but they are beginning to dream of being thrown away, of letting the branches find their own, supposedly more natural, mathematically perfect form. Let's now talk about the one thing that underpinned every single snip, every moved ton of earth, every length of lead pipe: money. Cold, hard, astronomical sums of it. We've wandered through philosophy and poetry, but this garden is first and foremost a financial instrument, a black hole for capital disguised as a paradise. So, pull up a stone bench in the shade and let's do the math. Let's translate this green symphony into the clinking, desperate sound of coins pouring into a bottomless, leafy pit. Because to understand the true scale of the Renaissance garden, you need to understand its receipt. Start with the land itself. This isn't just buying a plot, it's transforming one. The initial earthworks, leveling hills, filling valleys, creating the flat stage for the geometric drama, required armies of laborers with shovels, baskets, and ox carts. Contemporary accounts from projects like the Boboli mention thousands of workdays just for the grading. Then, the plants. A single mature, specimen yew tree for an instant hedge could cost a small fortune. The parterres required thousands of tiny boxwood plants, each needing to be cultivated for years in a nursery before planting. And the mortality rate was high. The bill for replacements alone was a constant, gnawing expense. The manual's advice to plant thickly and thin later wasn't just horticultural. It was a hedge against financial loss. The mainstream historical fact that crystallizes this is the emergence of the professional garden designer and contractor as a distinct, and often wealthy, figure. Men like André Le Notre in France didn't just draw pretty pictures, they were CEOs of massive landscaping firms. They managed budgets, sourced materials, hired and fed work crews, and negotiated with hydraulic engineers and sculptors. They sold a total package. Their fees were colossal. A single design could set a patron back the equivalent of building a small palace wing. The garden was no longer a hobby for the landowner. It was a capital project, with all the risk, debt, and potential for scandal that entailed. A poorly drained parterre wasn't just a soggy mess, it was a bad investment. The obsession with white gravel. Those blindingly white paths weren't just found underfoot. The gravel was often crushed marble or limestone, sourced from specific quarries, washed, sieved, and transported at great expense. But it got dirty. It got stained by leaves, mud, and the aforementioned bird droppings. So, the maintenance manuals include meticulous instructions for the gravel gang. Their job was to regularly rake, sift, wash, and even turn the gravel to keep it perpetually pristine and white. Imagine paying a team of men to literally turn over millions of tiny white stones by hand, week after week, year after year, for the sole purpose of maintaining a visual effect of sterile purity. It's perhaps the most perfect metaphor for the entire endeavor. A staggering investment of human effort to maintain an illusion of effortless, static perfection. This leads to an economic debate with sharp teeth. Historians still argue whether these gardens functioned as economic stimuli or sinks. Did they pump money into the local economy through employment and the purchase of materials, spreading wealth to masons, carters, nurserymen, and laborers? Or did they simply suck vast capital from productive enterprises, like farming or trade, and bury it in purely decorative, non-productive land, effectively sterilizing wealth? Was the Cardinal's Garden a job creation scheme or the world's most beautiful piggy bank, smashed open and emptied onto the dirt? The truth is it was both, but the balance determined a garden's legacy. A garden that employed a village for generations was one thing. A garden that bankrupted an estate and left the workers unpaid was another story entirely, often written in the angry scratches of vines reclaiming the parterre after the family fled their creditors. So, as you sit on that bench, look at the white path not as a path, but as a river of silver coins, flowing endlessly from the palace coffers to be ground underfoot. See each topiary peacock not as art, but as a ledger entry representing 50 days of a skilled topiarius's wages, his food, his shears, and the lime wash to protect the leaves from sun scald. The silence of the garden is not peace, it's the quiet after the financial explosion. The geometry is beautiful, yes, but it's a beauty purchased on credit, maintained by an endless drip feed of gold, and always one bad harvest, one war, one patron's death away from collapsing back into the financially solvent, and decidedly geometric, wild. We've followed the geometry from its birth in a humanist mind to its glorious, bankrupting maturity and its eventual, sighing transformation. Now, as our walk nears its end, we arrive at the final question: what's left? The torchlit theatres are dark. The fontainier has long since packed away his tools. The cardinal's bones are dust. But the urge that built his garden, the desire to impose a line, to argue with wilderness, to find meaning in shape, that didn't die. It just went suburban. So, let's take one last look from the terrace, not at the past, but at the long, green shadow it casts over your own world. Look at your own neighborhood, if you have one. See the houses with their little squares of lawn, edged with perfect, low boxwood or privet hedges. See the topiary globes flanking a front door. See the meticulous, mowed stripes on a golf course fairway, a vast, manicured parody of a meadow. This isn't an accident of taste. It's the direct, diluted inheritance of the Renaissance dream. The American suburb, with its covenant-controlled lawns and prohibitions against unsightly natural growth, is the democratic, mass-produced child of the Bobble-eye Gardens. The message is the same, if less articulate: control is good. Order is safe. A trimmed hedge is a civilized hedge. The geometric garden didn't vanish. It just got parceled out into a million tiny, mortgage-backed fractions. The mainstream historical lineage is clear in the profession of landscape architecture. Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of New York Central Park, was inheritor to both traditions. The park itself is the ultimate bosque naturel, a manufactured wilderness for the masses, with its carefully composed picturesque views and its hidden infrastructure, like the sunken transverse roads that are direct descendants of the ha-ha. But Olmsted also designed wealthy estates with formal elements: terraces, allays, rose gardens, plucked straight from the Renaissance playbook. The 20th century obsession with the pristine, weed-free lawn is a direct, if mindless, continuation of the Renaissance obsession with the perfect, raked tapis vert, green carpet. We are still trimming hedges like mathematics, We've just forgotten the theorem we're trying to prove. The quest for the perfect, sterile plant. The Renaissance sought control through form. We seek it through genetics. The modern landscaping industry is built on cultivars bred for docility. Dwarf varieties that won't outgrow their space, sterile hybrids that won't produce messy seeds or fruits, disease-resistant clones that guarantee uniformity. We want our green geometry to be maintenance-free, a frozen perfection. The ultimate Renaissance plant would be a plastic boxwood that never grows, never browns, and only needs an occasional hosing down. In many ways, we've invented it. Our rebellion against the shears has led us to invent plants that don't need shearing, achieving the Renaissance ideal of static order by bypassing life itself. It's control, perfected. This brings us to our final, overarching scholarly debate, one that echoes from the Cardinal's terrace to your own backyard. Historians, and now ecologists and philosophers, still argue whether this ingrained desire for geometric order in our surroundings represents a healthy human instinct for harmony and safety, or a profound, ecologically damaging alienation from the natural processes of growth, decay, and wild complexity. Is a tidy garden a sign of a tidy mind, or a symptom of a fear of life's inherent messiness? Was the Renaissance garden the peak of human collaboration with nature, or the beginning of our dysfunctional, high-maintenance divorce from it? The answer you lean toward will dictate whether you see your neighbor's perfect lawn as a thing of beauty, or as a tiny, green crime against biodiversity. So, as you finally turn from the view, the scent of boxwood lingering like a ghost, understand this. You carry the Renaissance gardener inside you. Every time you line up a pot on a patio, edge a flower bed, or feel a vague unease at a dandelion in the lawn, you are channeling that 500-year-old desire to draw a line in the sand, or in the soil, and say, here, order begins. The tools have changed from iron shears to gas-powered trimmers. The scale has shrunk from dukedoms to duplexes, but the silent, green argument continues. The wilderness whispers, grow. And a part of you, heir to Alberti and the Medici, still wants to hand it a set of blueprints. And so, the shears are stilled. The last line of the green theorem has been drawn, not in ink or in leaf, but in the quiet of your own thoughts. The Cardinal's dream, for all its grandeur and folly, was a human dream, a dream of clarity in a confusing world, of meaning found in shape, of a dialogue with chaos where we got to write the opening line. That dialogue never really ends. It just slows, softens, becomes the gentle rhythm of your own breath in the dark. Tonight, you walked through a world where intellect dared to dress nature in the garments of geometry. You felt the ache in the laborer's back, the cool calculation of the architect's compass, the damp spray from a coerced fountain. You saw how a hedge could be a wall, a symbol, a stage, and a ledger entry. It was a world of breathtaking ambition, where the very concept of outdoors was brought indoors and given a strict dress code. Now, let that world fade. Let the sharp angles of the parterre blur into the soft edges of sleep. Let the snick-snick of the shears become the distant, rhythmic sound of a gentle rain, which, unlike the fountain, falls without design, without coercion, blessing the ordered and the wild alike. The garden's ultimate lesson may be that control is a fleeting season, while growth is the perennial constant. So release the need for perfect lines. Unclench the hand that wants to trim and tame. Allow your mind, that most magnificent and untamed of gardens, to simply be. Let thoughts grow where they will, tangling and blossoming without a plan. There is no design to follow here, no manual for this final, quiet space. Just the deep, comforting dark, and the gentle, UN-pruned freedom of dreams.